You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
And we're back with another episode of One Free Family. This is James.
And Taylor.
And we've got the giggles, folks. That's the good news. We also have a fun topic to bring to you today. But first, we want to say thank you to all of our friends in the One Free Family Facebook group, because this subject and many others are coming directly from that group. It's actually one of the first places we look when we're ever suffering from any sort of creative block. What is it called? Podcasting block? Is that a thing?
Nope.
Well, it is now. Whenever we're suffering from podcasting block, we head on over to our Facebook group for good ideas on things to talk about. So if you ever have any specific ideas or concerns you want to share with other like-minded families or bring up to us, that's a great place to do it.
One Free Family on Facebook.
That's the one. Today's subject is kind of like bad influences and people in our kids' lives who may not be treating them the best. Is that a good way to sum it up?
I think so. We did an episode a while back. We should have looked up what number it was, but we didn't. It was a grab bag episode, right? Yeah. And one of the topics was about kind of bad influences more online. How do we tune into what our kids are paying attention to online and keep them safe? So this is a little bit different. This is, more like our kids spending time with people who maybe aren't treating them so well and how we navigate that situation.
Yeah, because I do think it's a very different situation, actually, because usually in the instance of hanging out with the wrong sort of crowd, oftentimes that's totally like voluntary and consensual. And for whatever reason, a kid might be experimenting with more reckless behaviors or hanging out with people who talk about naughty subjects or naughty subjects, steer clear, or just talking inappropriately language-wise or making inappropriate jokes or whatever. I think that other episode you talked about, that was actually a grab bag episode, our most listened to ever, that also talked about Santa. So if you looked on our website for the Santa episode, it's also in that one. Yeah, today is more about almost like when our kids enter into a toxic relationship with someone. This can manifest itself as bullying in school. It can be, like in the case of the discussion brought up in our One Free Family Facebook group, it was actually a relative. So I think it was like
another kid relative.
Right. And this is going to be kid to kid sort of stuff is what we're going to primarily be talking about today. I think adult to kid is a totally different
conversation.
Can of worms, ball of wax. It's a totally different situation. So yeah, that's what we're hoping to address today. So to kind of lay some groundwork for you, in the case of our Facebook group, essentially the idea was they get together with this one family member, and that family was a lot more strict and a lot more punitive with their daughter. They had sent her to a conservative school, and at that school, well, who knows what was happening at that school?
Yeah, we have no idea.
I have some thoughts that what might be happening there. But now when their family hangs out with this daughter, that daughter is giving their kids lots of rules and giving them 3 strikes and they're out policies and, just kind of being generally unkind to them. And
it probably stands to be said that, I think if I read it correctly, the cousin who is treating them this way is not a ton, but maybe a couple years older.
Yeah, oftentimes.
Which I think that's important to mention, because with that age difference, I think it's like they're kids, but maybe 4 or 5 years of an age difference, that can be kind of a power imbalance.
Totally. 1 year can be a power imbalance. Yeah. Simple developmental variance can be a power imbalance, right? You'll see kids that are a lot more clicked in and tuned into things than even their same-aged peers. And this is
that's true.
When you see the alpha guy in the group of middle schoolers, or sometimes the classic supposed mean girl group of the leader of the group. That sort of situation can arise in any number of scenarios. And I actually have a lot of mixed thoughts about this subject, so hopefully we'll be able to sift through it. You're raising your eyebrows. You're intrigued. Taylor's intrigued. So hopefully
very, very intrigued.
Y'all are intrigued as well. To start things off, my tendency when my kid will bring something like this to me is to feel angry and almost hurt on their behalf. I think it's always really helpful to recognize that whenever our children bring us something like this, it's an incredible gift, an opportunity. It's a hugely positive sign that your kid really trusts you and sees you as someone that can help them with this. Right?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes this toxic person will make threats like, you better not tell anybody or whatever. And the fact that they're coming to you anyway shows their belief that you can do something for them. And whether you can or not, frankly, that's still a good signal that the relationship is going well.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah. And I also think it's important to recognize that often for a lot of kids, that is a big step. They often, you can read this in their body language too, but they'll feel anxious about it. They'll feel worried to come to you because they know it's like a bad situation, and sometimes that's just hard.
Yes, even if it's not necessarily that they're nervous about telling you in particular, it could be more that when you bring it up, then you know, like, okay, I'm finally acknowledging this. Like, this is happening and it's been hard for me, and now I'm bringing it to the surface and telling somebody, which means like something might come out of it. And yeah, I think sometimes kids stay quiet because that feels scary.
Yeah. And I have a couple like kind of high level thoughts about bullying and people mistreating one another. And a lot of this comes from my work in working with young people. And one of the differences between being like an administrator or facilitator of a large group of kids and parenting your own child as they venture off into the world is that oftentimes you won't have very much control over the situation. You won't have really any influence over the other party. Like,
you mean when you're dealing with it with your own child?
Yeah. Like if my parents would have come into middle school and tried to talk to the kid that was bullying me, well, that would not have gone well for me or for anyone involved, right? So that can lead to a feeling of powerlessness in some cases, right? It's like, you just don't know what you should do. But I think by helping our kids work through this mentally, there is actually a lot that we can do. And I think actually it's a much more direct approach to helping our children, because dealing with any individual bully going out and saying, like I did when my brothers were being bullied when I was a kid and I went out and threatened the kid that was bullying them, that deals with the one bully, but it doesn't really help insulate the person against situations like this.
Yeah, maybe like this is a conversation about balancing the need to the feeling of the need to address the person who's doing the bullying. And I think in some cases, even with this example, we're going to talk about how to maybe do that. And like you're saying, James, like helping your kids develop the tools and the resilience to handle these situations well whenever they encounter them in life. And I think because even if you deal with this one situation with this one child who might be bullying your kid, it's going to happen again at some point in their lives. So I think I personally think there are ways, especially in this example that we're going to talk about, that you can try to also communicate with the person who kind of is bullying. And I think it is really important to balance that with giving your kids skills and tools and not just kind of swooping in and taking care of it without any conversation with your kids and kind of coaching and guidance around how to handle these situations as they come up in the future.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and also on a high level, when it comes to discussions around bullying, there's a woman I read named Nancy Willard who's got a website, and she's tried to work with schools, camps, and so on and so forth. But she has consolidated a lot of really excellent research on why people bully, how to prevent bullying in school-type environments or environments where large groups of people are gathered together. And some of that actually is appropriate here, but I'll link to that in the show notes too for people that are just curious, because I do think bullying is a fascinating phenomenon. It's obviously extremely unpleasant and has caused no shortage of heartache, but I think understanding it better can lead to handling these situations better with our own kids and helping them to gain perspective. Because a lot of times, especially for kids that have been treated pretty well by their parents and the people close to them, the situation is just so shocking and
so confusing,
and so disorienting, and oftentimes it makes them feel as though they've done something wrong.
Right. I guess if you think about a kid who's maybe never been to school and a kid who's being raised by parents who are try to be gentle and don't use punitive measures in their own home, you're right, it could probably feel just incredibly surprising and confusing and shocking the first time a kid experiences it.
Well, and even if your kid has been to school, many kids go to school and aren't bullied, at least for quite a long time, right? And so there's always, for everyone, if you experience this ever, there's the first time that person says something unkind to you or is kind of taking advantage of you or trying to manipulate you or whatever. It's really unpleasant and very disorienting. And when you're caught off guard, some people can freeze, some people can kind of go with it, some people fight back. It's very unpredictable how people are going to handle a situation like this, but it's extremely unpleasant and difficult for them to deal with. So...
Well, did you want to say anything then now about just the thoughts on why people bully and just kind of...
Dude, that's exactly where I was going.
Look at us.
Yeah, okay. You read my mind, lady.
All right.
So the first thing I was going to say was, one of the things Nancy points out on her site is that very often bullying takes place in environments where people are forced to be with one another, right? So where are people forced to be with one another? Usually schools, prisons, Sometimes in the Army, it can feel this way. And many of these institutions have serious problems with bullying and serious policies around dealing with it. And those policies are of kind of mixed effectiveness. Bullying can also take place in families because people feel this compulsion to keep the family unit together. In many cases, like if it's your brother bullying you, you kind of are forced together for a very, very long time, or what feels like forever. And that's why one of the first things I try to communicate whenever I'm interacting with someone who's being mistreated is making them aware that they do have the opportunity to walk away from that situation, right? I'm reminded of a close friend of ours who is in a really toxic situation at work, and it became very obvious to her very quickly that the bosses at this particular institution had been mistreating people for a long time.
Right.
Like, she walked in and it was like honeymoon phase for 2 weeks, and then the bosses came right in with this like terrible mean-spiritedness.
Yeah, it was toxic.
Yeah, really, really bad. And our friend noticed this because she hasn't been willing to subject herself to things like this very much in the past, and kind of very quickly extricated herself from the situation as soon as it became realistic too. And I remember hearing the reflections, like these other people that were there were kind of amazed that she could walk away from it so quickly. And this is step one, is helping our kids and our friends and those close to us recognize that feeling trapped in a situation is often an illusion. Now, for kids, unfortunately, it can be a reality.
It's not
sometimes.
always, yeah.
But for most people, for grown-ups especially, it is an illusion. Yeah, this job is comfortable and I'm getting paid well here, but you don't have to keep going to that specific job. There are usually measures we can take in our lives to walk away. So when I'm talking to my kids and someone is treating them in a way they don't like, the first thing I'll remind them is like, you can just walk away from that person, right? And when people really start to believe this, you can see this, and I've done it in environments in camps and not in schools, I guess, but in camps, and you see this like relief wash over them as they become aware of this, like, oh, I don't?
Well, because I think, I mean, I will say for kids who are in school, maybe they're in the classroom with a bully, or maybe they're experiencing it within their own family or something, they can't walk away. And so I think some kids just come to, learn to accept this feeling of being trapped in that situation. And so when they are in situations where they actually can make a choice to remove themselves, like you said, it almost feels surprising. They're like, oh, wait, yeah, I don't have to just stay in this.
Well, yeah, and when it comes to like our kids, and I would hope for most people's kids out there, I think exploring every single option to make it a reality that your kid can walk away 100%. From a bully or a person engaging in bullying behavior. I don't like to label the bullies.
Yeah, I don't
we'll get
either.
to where that all comes from in a second. But to walk away from a situation where they're being bullied. And so whether that means going to the school and saying, hey, can we switch out of this team? Can we switch out of this school? And at the very least, because oftentimes our kids won't want to do that, you'll notice, like, I remember seeing this at camp sometimes where I would have a child I was speaking to who didn't like how they were being treated, and they were expressing that feeling of helplessness. And I would say, well, you can leave. We'll put you in a different cabin. We'll bring you out of there. And then sometimes, though, they'll say, but I don't want to. All my friends are there. But then it's a totally different situation for them, because now we're discussing, okay, well, how can, given that you're choosing to walk back in there, how can we equip you with the tools you'll need to handle this if it arises again? Versus like, oh, I'm sending you back to the wolves regardless.
Right, because I think even if they don't want to leave, knowing that they have the option frees up so much emotional energy, like you said, to think about, okay, well, being that I have a choice and I'm choosing to stay, now I feel safe because I know that I still can change my mind and leave. So now I have like the emotional and mental wherewithal to think about how I can handle this now.
Exactly. Think about times
you're
in
not
your
in
life.
Fight or flight anymore.
Exactly. Think about times in your life where you've felt free to walk away from a bad situation, whether it's a bad job or a bad relationship or a bad friendship or whatever, versus times where you felt trapped, and how different you acted and how much less confidence you approached the situation with. And yeah, I think it's night and day. So whenever possible, communicating to our kids, really helping them to believe that it's their choice whether they return to that relationship or not. And
I know it's hard to, or it might, I don't know. I'm guessing it might be hard to hear this, especially for maybe people whose kids have experienced bullying in school or something. But I just have to say, like, I've heard so many stories, especially when kids get to like the middle school, high school level. You know, you hear it all the time on the news, you read about it, you hear stories like about kids being mistreated so badly. And so many times parents don't even stop to think like, oh, I can take my kid out of this place. It's like we as a part of this society are so conditioned to feel like we're just stuck in this public school system that exists in our town. And I just really encourage people. It's uncomfortable because it might require a lot of things to change, but I just think that our kids' emotional safety is so important. I just really encourage people to like really think outside the box and recognize that there might be options that you haven't thought of yet.
For sure. And I think especially, and I don't know if we intended to talk this much about bullying in schools and stuff, but I think it probably is appropriate. One thing I would strongly encourage parents to do, especially now, I don't know if we've ever talked about it on the show, but I've been going and doing some work with the Big Fish Learning Cooperative here in Dover, and we work with a lot of kids who have left school and are now going down a more self-directed path with us. And a lot of the reasons, as you can imagine, that people are leaving school is because they're feeling like they're being mistreated by somebody at the school, whether it's someone who works there or someone who attends there. And I always encourage parents to walk in and ask the people that are working there, so what are you doing to help with this situation now that you're aware of it? And if they say nothing, then they really ought to be supportive in helping you find a different situation. Yeah. And as soon as you put it in their court, this is also like, it's kind of like a dog whistle to their liability, where you're like, so now that you're aware of this, what have you been doing to take care of it for my child who's being mistreated here? That can really alert them like, oh yeah, this really is our responsibility. Right. And if we're not doing something about it, we're in the wrong, right? So anyway, yeah, step one, do whatever possible to help our child to see that they can walk away. And actually, you had talked before we got started today, in this particular instance, we're talking about a family member, right?
A cousin, yeah.
Yeah, and that can be a whole different emotional situation where, as a parent and just as a human being, now I'm working through not only helping my child with this seriously stressful emotional situation, but I'm probably entering into one myself, right?
When it's just, it can get, I think, a little bit tricky when you're dealing with family. Because in this situation, the person mentioned that they had talked a little bit to the kids' parents, but there wasn't really much acknowledgement about what was going on, not being okay. And then this person was expressing some more fear that if they tried to, in the light of like recent things that have happened again, that if they tried to bring it up again, it might just trickle down and make it worse for her own kids, like have them be bullied even more by this child. And I get it. Like, I understand how tricky and how hard that is, because that requires you to put this all on the table and talk to your family members who you love. And every family approaches conflict and confrontation differently. And I think a lot of families really struggle with that within their own families. A lot of times people just don't want to say anything.
Well, and that's why I would always approach a situation of that nature, starting from the position of, we're going to find healing here, and walking into the situation and say, my absolute top priority is that we heal the relationship between everyone here. And I'm really hoping for your support in this because, and then going on to describe the situation as objectively and neutrally as possible without saying like, your daughter's a bully or something like that.
Well, because you can also go into it holding, you talked about how your first reaction when you hear about your kid being mistreated is anger and protectiveness, and mine is too. And I think there's a piece of remembering, and you said this before we started recording, that the child who is mistreating other people is likely really hurting themselves, right? We talk about that phrase, hurt people, hurt people. So being able to recognize that this is another child who is treating other people this way for a reason, right? And it doesn't justify the behavior. And I think that the child can still be held responsible and accountable and brought into some conversations and supported to figure out how to change the way they're acting. But they're likely really struggling within themselves or being bullied themselves elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think and this is like a message that's often conveyed to people who are being bullied, but in a way that doesn't really solve the situation.
Sure.
Where like I can remember as a kid being mistreated by other kids and hearing from grown-ups like, oh, it's just because they're unhappy. You're like, sweet, that's good to know.
Yeah, I can't stop there.
They keep doing this to me. But and I think this is like really where we want to be intentional about how we sculpt these conversations with our kids, because that can seem like, that can be conveyed either as, well, and now we're helpless to do anything about it because they're just unhappy. So kind of just understand that the best revenge is success or whatever, or we can have that be a part of a broader discussion where we're talking about how we're going to help them work through the situation. So I really like that saying, like the hurt people idea being brought up much later in the conversation, where first we convey to our child that they can always walk away from the situation and we're going to really, really support them in doing it. And from there, helping them to work through what their options are in terms of addressing this. And also where I would bring in the hurt people idea with our kids is helping them to not take it personally, because a lot of times they, like I said, when they're being mistreated, they feel as though they must have done something wrong.
Right.
And they blame themselves and they're wondering, well, what did I do to make Susie be so mean to me? And at that point, it can be useful to help them to understand, like, well, why do you think Susie does this?
Right,
like,
that it's not really about them.
Isn't this really unusual behavior, what Susie's doing? Because when we can draw the attention to the negative behavior and away from whether they deserve it or not, because they obviously don't, that's back to a Nancy Willard idea, which is the idea of establishing positive social norms, where when we can help our kids to understand that this is not normal behavior, that most people don't act this way, and most people don't like being treated this way, and most people don't respect others who act this way, that we can help them to understand, okay, Susie is not the cool ringleader of the whole group.
This is not normal.
Yeah,
right?
And Nancy has some really cool research that she points to that talks about how one of the most effective anti-bullying tools, such as they are like there's a great example of a school that polled all their students and asked them questions like, when you see someone engaging in bullying behavior, are you more or less likely to want to spend time with them? Do you think they're cool, or do you think that they're like, that there's something kind of wrong with them or whatever? That wasn't exactly how it was worded, but asking them questions like that. And then they posted the results all throughout the hallways. And it was like 88% of Heightstown middle schoolers say that they actually like someone less when they see them engaging in bullying behavior.
Idea. Yeah.
And they posted that all around, and that actually led to a reduction in bullying at their school.
That's so interesting. I just like struggle to wrap my head around that happening in a school too, because I think the inherent nature makes it hard. Like I'm amazed that happened, and I think that's awesome. But I just feel like kids in general in school are so powerless that I think that sometimes feeds this bullying behavior.
Well, and I think it just takes a really special set of facilitators,
administrators and teachers,
take it seriously enough and say, like, all right, we're going to set down the math books for today, because today is all about us figuring out how we can treat each other with more kindness. And it's a lot of why I transitioned my work with kids out of institutions where academics were the top priority. For me, the top priority is how people treat one another. And I know that there are people that are places that work with kids out there who feel the same way. I just didn't have very much success in finding them until now that I'm at Big Fish. So helping our kids understand that, because obviously we don't want our kids, like a lot of times we learn that our kids are being bullied because they'll start bullying their little sibling or they'll be acting that way towards other kids in the neighborhood or whatever.
Well, and the cool thing is, again, to go back to what you said when we started, is that in the situation that the person was talking about in our group, again, the fact that their kid came to them to talk to them about it kind of shows that their kid already realizes, like, this isn't normal, right? They've, in their family, established this really healthy culture of what is a normal way that we treat people. And so, again, that's just you're starting from a really good place there.
Yeah, I think so. So to refresh our steps, helping our kids to know that they can walk away, helping them to kind of do the math in their own mind about whether this relationship feels like one that's worth returning to, and then helping them to understand and to work through why it might be happening in the first place.
Yeah,
I think that's a good...
Can we go back to the second one you said? Because I don't think we talked that much about that.
No,
and I think this is the biggest piece, actually, like helping our kids decide for themselves if this relationship is important enough to keep going back to. And that one, it's not black and white. I don't think it's super clear how, you never know what answer is going to come out of it. But I think, and it depends on how old your child is, right? Kind of what they're, how well they express themselves. But it's about talking to your kid like, okay, so you're not liking the way that you're being treated by this person. Again, reminder that we can make sure that you can walk away and not be near them if it's not feeling okay or safe for you. And are there reasons that you'd like to try to work on this relationship with this person, and what are those reasons? And just exploring that with your kid. So then you kind of know, after you have some of those conversations, like, are we going to put in some support and have the hard conversations to see if this can move in a healthier direction? Or are we just going to take a long break here and maybe come back to it later if we want to? And I think a lot of that has to come from your kid and what they think they want to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think helping them weigh, asking questions like, well, what do you like about spending time with Susie? Oh, she's really fun and has creative ideas. Well, that might be a really nice thing to communicate to Susie next time. And if you want my help, I can help you have this conversation. That might be a nice thing to communicate to her before you let her know about these behaviors you don't appreciate, right? So you can sit there and say, and I facilitated discussions like this between kids at camp where you say, hey, I really love spending time with you because we play these really cool creative games in the clubhouse. What I really don't like is when you threaten to kick me out of the club, because when you do that, it just makes me wonder if it feels worth it to play with you at all. Because then Susie might think, because then she can actually sit there and say, oh, I really wanted to get my way. And when little Johnny was disagreeing with me about that, I used the same tactics that have been used on me, which is threatening to kick Johnny out of the club. But actually, I just really want Johnny to be in the club because I don't want to play by myself. Because a lot of times, these people engaging in bullying behavior, they actually don't have bad intentions. It's that they have an unmet need, which is that they want to get their way in the game, or they want to accomplish something, or they're having trouble being persuasive, and so they resort to threats.
Right. They just maybe don't have better strategies yet.
They don't have better strategies yet, because I don't think that... I'm sure there are some small percentage of people who just want to hurt others, but in this case, it's usually that they're not getting their way in the context of how people are spending their time, and they are turning to what's tactics that have been used on them. Like in the case of this Facebook group, the kid was literally putting initials on the board in their area where they were hanging out and putting strikes next to their name. Guess what? That kid didn't learn that behavior from their own brain. Yeah. They saw it happening somewhere, probably in school.
Yeah, you talked about how that happened in one of your classrooms as a kid.
I had that in a math class when I was in middle school. And so this is just a technique that people in power have used to control people with less power. And so it's unsurprising that our kids would turn to the same techniques that they've seen used. But again, facilitating that conversation between our kid and the other child, especially if it's a family member, I think it can actually be very appropriate there and say, oh, so you really wanted to get this accomplished in the game. Were there other ways that we could have had it so you could do the thing you wanted? And
it's helping the other kid too, kind of talk about and learn and think about different strategies.
Right, and many times we're not going to be in a position to facilitate conversations like that. Often school X where you don't know 99% of the kids.
Right, but in this situation you totally are.
Yeah,
and I think you ultimately end up helping the kid who's engaging in that behavior a lot too when you open up this type of conversation with them and help them learn some new skills and tools.
And I think it's actually a really good opportunity for thinking about how we talk to the other parents or other interested parties here, because the person in our group talked about how the guardians for the child in question weren't very receptive to her concerns about it. And I've had that experience too, where it just kind of makes those people feel uncomfortable and like they don't really know how to address it. But if we come with strategies or we come with a plan and we come and say, hey, my daughter was reporting this behavior when they played with Susie, and I was hoping to facilitate a conversation between them where I was going to talk to Susie about how when she wants different things to happen in the game, some other strategies. Would that be okay with you? And here's my plan for some things I was going to say.
I like that because you're coming at it more of like, almost like what you said before. My daughter really loves playing with Susie because of X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And these other things are happening that are making it really hard and upsetting. And like you said, I'd like to try to facilitate a conversation to help them. Then you're coming at it from like a, let's be problem solvers. I think this can work perspective, as opposed to just like, your kid did this to my kid. And then the person is just straight up on the defensive right away.
Exactly. We're coming at this because oftentimes too, those guardians, parents, whoever, are feeling concerned about that behavior, that it's easier to want to stick up for your kid, especially if you're already trying things like, we already punished Susie.
Right.
We took away her dessert 3 nights in a row when the school told us she was bullying.
Yeah.
Okay, we're bullying her and she's surprisingly
continuing to
still
bully.
continuing
But
to
sometimes, again, just like Susie, even grown-ups don't have better strategies if they've never had an opportunity or been asked to think about them or taught them.
Well, yeah, and frankly, we're lucky because we spent our lives training to work with kids. And so when you have kids, that's like a kind of a nice synergy there. Most people have spent their lives training to, I don't know, be an accountant or an entrepreneur or whatever else, and haven't had the time or the bandwidth to.
And it's like not easy.
Exactly. And when you haven't intentionally gone out of your way to learn something, you're going to default to what you've seen in the past, right?
Yeah,
so,
that's a great point.
Yeah, trying to facilitate a nice, healthy conversation, offer yourself up as the person to facilitate it, because that can relieve some of the comfort. And of course, inviting them to be a part of it.
For sure.
I'd like to have a conversation with all of us around how we can help the kids work through this, right? They might feel relieved. They might think, okay, well, this isn't going to work, but sure, she can try, right?
Yeah.
And that can be a nice opportunity.
And I think, especially with family, I think that families, and I'm not necessarily talking about this particular family because I just don't know the details of their, their family history and their life. But I think when we think about confronting our family members, it feels really, really hard. And I really believe that being the person to be able to kind of step up and have this conversation, you have the opportunity to kind of like change the story of what your family does when they're experiencing conflict. And I think a lot of families just stay quiet and just pretend it's not happening.
Right.
And it's easier that way. And when we can be the person to be willing to go to that uncomfortable place, we might actually be able to change things for our family. And not always. And that's really hard too. And I think that sometimes can feel scary. It's like, okay, well, if I do this and then it doesn't work, then things are even going to get worse. And I think we have to be willing to kind of own that and know that things aren't okay as they are right now. And so we're going to do our best to help change them for the better. And if it were me in a situation like this and I tried to do all of this and none of it worked, as hard as it is, I'd probably, if this is what my kid wanted to, would be taking quite a long break from spending a lot of time with these people if my kid was continuing to be mistreated.
Right. And you can communicate that in advance, not as a threat, but just as a heads up, right? Where you say, my top priority, I'm sure you can understand, has to be helping my kid to feel safe and heard. And it's just really difficult to do that when we're all together because of X, Y, and Z. And so, I think, why don't we just call it until try this again at Thanksgiving or whatever and come back to it then and recognize or communicate that the relationships are still important to you, and it's really important to you that while your kid is in their formative years, they're not being put through situations that they kind of can't comprehend or manage.
Totally.
Right? And I can think that brings us into, actually, there's one more thing I want to do before we get to the last little piece. And that's talking about this next step with our kids, which is to help them work through the actual things that have been said to them and the behaviors that have kind of occurred. Because helping our kids to gain perspective, because sometimes they'll hear mean things and someone will convey those mean things in such a way that actually makes our kids feel like they're important, right? So, like
the thing they said is
important. Like kids will say things like, you really suck at soccer. Like I remember our kid, he was in a soccer, this little rec soccer league, and one of the kids said something like, honestly, you're trash at soccer to him, right? And when our child conveyed this to me, I, of course, felt very defensive and angry and wanted to stand up for him and get something done about it. Just my brain went to that.
Well, and tell me it wasn't like coming up from your own childhood too, right? Of being bullied and talked to that way. That's huge.
Yeah, I can put myself in those shoes and know how it feels to be talked to that way. And I was able to call myself enough to ask, like, well, how did you feel when he said that? Because our kid didn't seem that upset about it.
I know. I think it's huge to like stop ourselves and ask them how they're feeling.
Yeah, because I don't want to tell my kid that he should feel bad about it. Because a lot of times something will happen with our kids and our emotional reaction to it will set the tone for then how they feel about it. And they might feel a lot more ashamed or upset if they see that we feel ashamed on their behalf, right? So in this instance, I did manage to gather myself and say, because again, he seemed like just surprisingly nonchalant.
He was almost just like reporting that it happened.
He was like, this was unusual,
Yeah.
And I asked how he felt. He said, oh, I didn't care because I know it's not true, And that caught me off guard. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that's good that he has this confidence around his own soccer abilities. But I think and then I was able to collect myself and say, and frankly, even if you weren't good at soccer, like it's soccer, right? Like soccer is just one of many, many thousands of things that we do over the course of the week and the month and the year. And being good or not good at any one of them, It doesn't change how worthy of being loved we are, right? And this came up in a future instance where he was working through being upset that he was not performing well in something that, that is important to him. And then we went back to that conversation and I reminded him, like, whatever part of you feels like you're worth less because you're not feeling competent at this one activity, think about the people in your life who you love. Like, would you care if grandma wasn't any good at soccer? Like, when you think about me and mommy, we're not good at this video game either, but we're not trash. We shouldn't be all that.
Do we seem less worthy to you because of that? Of course not. Yeah.
And if we can help our kids gain that perspective and say, like, someone's worth or how much they're worthy of being loved or whatever, shouldn't be tied to this one thing that someone was scolding us about. Helping them gain some perspective. It won't always cure it in the moment. Like, we want to validate their feelings. Yeah. Being good at soccer, if it had felt more important to him and he was feeling insecure about it, we want to validate those feelings, of course. But in the long run, helping our kids to really understand that their worth isn't tied to their ability to do X, Y, or Z, or to be a part of X, Y, or Z friend group or whatever.
Right, because I think when you do that, you help them feel empowered to not go back to situations where people treat them that way because they feel comfortable in their worth not being tied to that.
Yeah, because if the most important thing in the world is being a part of this club, then they should feel bad about not being a part of it, right? But helping them to really understand and work through for themselves if it feels important to them. And if it does, why? Well, why does it feel important to be a part of the club?
Yeah.
Well, that's where all the kids hang out. Well, what do you think? What about those other kids? Do you think they like these rules? Well, no, we always look at each other and feel sad when Susie starts telling us about these rules. Well, could you start your own club? Like, just working, again, just modeling for them the process of working through the options that are available to us when we encounter the unusual circumstance of someone behaving toxically. Because I think, again, this idea that you're going to have to deal with this in the quote-unquote real world.
Yeah, I'm glad I was going to say something about that.
You want to go for it?
Well, no, finish what you're saying.
Well, that idea, it actually is true. You will deal with people like this in the real world. The myth is that they're just all over the place.
Well, and I think the myth is that you just have to take it. Like, the myth is like that you have to deal with it and keep going back to it and just learn how to steel yourself against it.
Right.
And that is the myth that I want to dispel. Because, so, like, even in this example about the soccer game, you helped our kid work through it, and then you did mention it to the coach, right?
Sure.
And I think a lot of parents would be like, well, why would you mention it to the coach? Like, kids just have to learn to deal with this kind of behavior. But you mentioned it to the coach, and he just talked to the team, right? Did he talk to the team or the kid?
The whole team.
He just talked to the team about kind of, I didn't hear it.
And the kid, actually. But what I expressed to the coach was, would you like to deal with this or should I? I said, you're the coach. I want to turn it to you. Yeah. And if you're feeling comfortable with it, I'm also happy to talk to Ronnie's family or whatever the kid's name was, right?
And then I think the coach just tried to handle it in the sense of, like, team culture and how we treat people.
He did his best.
Yeah, and I think that too, again, I think some parents would look at that and be like, come on, kids just have to deal with this. It happens. But actually, no. Like, we have an opportunity to send a message to kids who are still really, really impressionable and, like you said, in their formative years that, again, this is not a norm, right? We're going to build positive norms. And when this sort of thing happens, like in this example on a team, we're going to mention it and we're going to talk about how we actually treat people. Because no, our kids don't have to learn that they just grow up to be adults and this happens all over the place and they just have to go back and take it and take it and take it. Yeah, it does happen. And I think actually preparing them for the fact that this stuff happens is helping them figure out what are the steps I can take to get myself out of that situation? How can I talk to the person who's treating me this way? How can I make a change instead of just how can I just go in there and just keep being abused, basically?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, and this brings me to the last piece that I just wanted to nod to a little bit before we close here, because we're running a little long, is that sometimes, and it's unusual, but it is possible, there will just be a situation that is abusive, that someone in a position of power, sometimes it's another child, oftentimes it's a grown-up, has just gained this level of power in the relationship with our kids where they seem to want to walk back into it, even though it's very obviously wrong.
Yeah.
And the way I've seen it manifested most often is actually from coaches to kids. I've seen this, I'm especially reminded of the soccer team I was on when I was a kid, where we had an abusive coach and I did walk away, but many other kids on the team that felt the same way didn't. And I remember feeling stunned when this coach returned to my parents and tried to help them see ways that I could return to the team. This was a totally bizarre situation where...
I don't think I know about this.
No, I don't think we've ever talked about it, and I didn't plan to talk about it until right now. But yeah, I was the goalie on this, competitive travel soccer team, and this coach was just terrible to me. We weren't a very good team, and I would give up lots of goals because that's what happens, right? And he would just be vitriolic to me about, so we would lose like 13-0 or something, right? And maybe we could have lost 8-0 if I had played better, right? Or who knows, or 11-0, But he would come and just like regale me with all these things I did wrong about how I choked and
it's awful.
This, that, or the other. And eventually I said, whatever, I quit, walked away from the situation. And then he went to my parents and was like, well, he could join and he wouldn't have to play goalie if he's not liking goalie. And it was like, well, it's not goalie, pal.
It's you.
It's it's not goal. I like playing goalie. It's that's why I came and wanted to dedicate so much time to playing goalie. It's being around you. But other kids on the team, he had convinced them that this dumb travel soccer team was the very most important thing in the world, and convinced them that their worth was tied up, and they were hanging on every word, ready for his praise or bracing for his threats or whatever, and they were just felt trapped in that situation. And maybe their parents made them feel that way. I'm not sure. And, kudos to my parents for seeing that it was toxic and helping me to walk away. But in situations like that, where someone gains that level of influence or hold, I do think it's appropriate if you're seeing the same misery day after day. I've heard this cliche, I guess, but about like gymnastics or figure skating or some of these where kids are trying to like pursue the Olympics. And oftentimes it's really talented kids that wind up feeling trapped by their own abilities. So saying like, life, living, happiness, more important than whatever pursuit.
So it's kind of like, I think we talked about including your kids in this and helping them decide if they feel like it's a relationship they want to go back to. But it sounds like you're also saying there's a point at which if maybe things, if they've tried to help things be more positive and they just keep going back to this situation, you think it might be appropriate to kind of really step in and be like, listen, you say you want to keep going back to this, but look at what's happening.
Well, yeah, and I think facilitating a conversation between our kids and whoever these people are and saying like, well, hey, I've now got some standards for how this is going to go. And sitting with kid and coach or kid, another kid or whoever, or teacher, and saying, something about the situation isn't right. Like, I've just seen my kid return in tears too often. And if they say something like, that's the price you need to pay if I coached someone into the Olympics in 1971 or whatever. And you say, cool, congratulations. And for our family, this isn't right. Are you ready to take the measures that we need for this to feel okay for us? Like, what are they going to do? Beat you up?
Right.
No, they're going to, maybe they'll bluster, maybe they'll tell you you're a loser or whatever. But ultimately, just recognizing that people that are still behaving that way into adulthood are doing so because they've made it work for themselves, which means they're really good at it and really good at making other people feel less than and like their voices shouldn't be heard. It's just an illusion.
And I think we teach our kids something really important and model something really important for them, which is like, if a person does not change their behavior after this many attempts of you trying to get them to, like, that person, you can have this feeling of wanting to keep going back, and that's not actually a healthy relationship. Right.
And it's hard. And I would turn to that as a last resort. I would try everything in my power to help my kid make the decision to, walk towards good relationships or walk away from bad ones. And just like I would if, a sister or brother of mine was in an abusive relationship at some point, I would take other measures. And that's I think appropriate in some circumstances. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Well, hope this was helpful.
Yeah, I think it was a good discussion.
Yeah, I think so too. I think if anything, clearly not everyone's going to agree with everything we say, but I think hopefully it'll get people thinking and talking. And if you're experiencing this in your own life with your kids, give you just some ideas or some places to start.
Yeah, we want to illuminate the choices that our kids have rather than close them off. And I think that can be true hopefully everywhere, but no more than in our relationships with others. We always should have the opportunity to walk away from relationships we don't want to and walk towards the ones we do.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey. And just remember that each moment is a new chance to be the parent that you hope to be.
We love you guys. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.